17 years ago, there was an MMORPG that pioneered the three-faction realm versus realm PvP endgame that many current MMOs such as ESO and Guild Wars 2 take inspiration from. This MMORPG went back to Arthurian legends of old, Dark Age of Camelot. It was the age of chivalry and the War of the Three Kingdoms. To the mountains, to the kingdom of Arthur's, Albion, to the forests located in the heart of the realm that made up the forces of the mythical kingdom of Hibernia, to the frigid, cold, snowed lands of the rebellious kingdom of Midgard. These three kingdoms caught in what seemed like a perpetual state of war. And this is what makes up the plot and background for Mythic Entertainment's first true MMORPG title, Dark Age of Camelot. Dark Age of Camelot at one point saw as many as 250,000 concurrent players, a true feat for a PvP-centric MMORPG, and managed to do so as a small company with a small budget, who went toe-to-toe with other MMORPG titans such as EverQuest, Ultima Online, and even later on, World of Warcraft. Dark Age of Camelot as of 2018 certainly isn't literally dead, and still has quite the dedicated core fanbase who play both the live server and the fan-created server Uthgard, but only a fraction of the same population it once had in its most successful years. On this episode of Death of a Game, we will uncover the mystery behind the MMORPG that helped define the PvP genre, and answer the question behind it all. Why didn't Dark Age of Camelot's reign last longer? Why did Dark Age of Camelot fade into obscurity? Take up arms and claim your faction, Midgard, Albion, or Hibernia, and prepare the drums of war. Oh, and make sure to pay attention to the clues. We can solve this one together, but if you miss out, I will take the time to catch you guys up near the end of the episode. And finally, at the end of this episode, there will be a clue for what the next episode is going to be on. So get working, detectives. Typically, I take the time to explain the whole origin of a company, but because Mythic can get its own company video done in the future, I'll focus for this video primarily on Dark Age of Camelot and Mythic's involvement with such. The story of Dark Age of Camelot starts in 1999. The company behind the title, Mythic Entertainment, had been founded officially in 1995, but the company itself had existed in two different companies, one led by Mark Jacobs and one Rob Denton. Between the two companies, they had an awful lot of experience in online games. Mark Jacobs had his company, Adventures Unlimited Software, and Rob Denton his, Interesting Systems Incorporated. When the two joined together in 1995, the main team existed of Mark Jacobs, the president, Rob Denton, the COO and co-founder, and the producer Matt Farrar. Mythic Entertainment pre-2000s launched a number of online games. Most influential and relevant for the story of Dark Age of Camelot, though, was their two projects, Darkness Falls: The Crusade and The Spellbinder: The Nexus Conflict. Darkness Falls was Mythic Entertainment's online MUD, meant to compete with EverQuest and Ultima Online. However, Darkness being a text-based title meant that it couldn't compete with either title enough for Mythic's liking. What was unique about Darkness Falls was in one simple facet of design, a feature that frankly changed how we look at MMORPGs for time to come: three-faction PvP. Yes, what Mythic discovered with their quiet title of Darkness Falls, their text-based title, was that they could create a game that had near endless amounts of content due to the fact that in their text-based MUD, you could PvP with three different factions. The basic design of the game was a three-faction PvP only game. You got realm points when you killed a player, and you were supposed to try and cap all of the realm orbs or idols. This was incredibly relevant for the creation of Dark Age of Camelot's base design. The idea was simple. If you could get players engaged and teach them to associate with one particular faction pride, you could have players long after the game's launch and content drought still enjoying the game. Tribalism, as problematic as it can be in society, is actually quite effective in video games. And as most DAOC fans watching this can agree, boy was Mythic absolutely right about that. But where Spellbinder: The Nexus Conflict title comes into play is establishing relationships with a gameplay engine. Spellbinder was an arena shooter game of sorts that was a fully represented graphical online RPG. As producer Matt Farrar later shared in a post-mortem on DAOC, after working with NetImmerse on Spellbinder: The Nexus Conflict, Dark Age of Camelot would be using the same game engine. Oh, NetImmerse is also known by the title Gamebryo. Yes, that same original Bethesda engine. The Gamebryo engine was pioneered first for MMOs, but Dark Age of Camelot would be using the NetImmerse engine, which is technically the same engine, just an older one. Dark Age of Camelot would be the first title to use this engine. The most important feature for Dark Age of Camelot was indeed its engine, ultimately, as it meant that with their newest title, it could be completely realized in graphical 3D, as well as it meant that they could compete with Ultima, and most importantly for the time, EverQuest 1. After completing the Spellbinder project, we decided to create a graphical online role-playing game to compete with the new wave of online RPGs, such as Ultima Online and EverQuest. We were taking traditional text-based games and adding a graphical front-end, with very successful results. Over the years, we had developed several non-graphical online role-playing games, including Dragon's Gate and Darkness Falls the Crusade. Because of our experience developing RPGs, we knew that it had to be a slightly different slant on our new title in order to distinguish it from the RPGs that were already on the market. So Mythic, with engine in hand, and the idea of what content their MMORPG would focus on in Darkness Falls 3-faction realm PvP, set out to work on their newest MMORPG. This title was to be dubbed Darkness Falls Conflict 3D, meant to be a sequel to Darkness Falls the Crusade title. But Mythic, despite having previous online titles, was not a company of immense wealth or success yet. They were operating on a budget and certainly didn't have the capital to purchase an IP, and their MMO was in desperate need of a setting. Matt Farrar later said that we were proceeding along the concept of DFC 3D until our president, Mark Jacobs, came up with the idea of basing the game at least partially on the Arthurian legends. It was a great idea since the stories of King Arthur are now in the public domain, which meant that we could use them with no fear of licensing issues. Of course, because the game was based on the idea that 3 realms were in conflict, we quickly came up with the idea of basing the other 2 realms on Norse Viking myths and Celtic Irish legends, respectively. Having the myths and legends of these 3 cultures give Camelot the feel of being 3 games in one, since each realm has different races, classes, guilds, terrain, and monsters. But Mythic hadn't had the kind of success that would allow them to solely focus on developing one game, and they would certainly need such for an MMO the size and scale of Dark Age of Camelot. They found an investor in the company Abandon Entertainment, who took a minority interest in Mythic, which allowed Mythic enough funding to fund their game from start to completion. So Darkness Falls Conflict 3D became Dark Age of Camelot, and around January 2000, Mythic began full production on Dark Age of Camelot. And unheard of for an MMO, they set their sights on a late 2001 launch, which would mean that they were going to develop the game in less than 2 years. So Mythic would not only develop the game in 18 months, they would do so with a budget of $2.5 million and a team of 25 full-time developers. Now that's quite a feat. Matt also said in the post-mortem piece, our spreadsheets showed that we had enough money to support exactly 18 months of development, starting from January 2000, giving the project a hard end date of September 2001. When funds say you only have 18 months to get your product out, 18 months is all you're gonna get. The way that Dark Age of Camelot was able to be developed in such a short time, besides, well, blood, sweat, and tears, is the fact that they developed the MMO with another engine superior to the one that Mythic had previously used. This meant that they didn't have to spend years developing their own engine system. In conjunction with this, they were able to use their original DFC titles' server code as platform for their newer game's backend. Another aspect that certainly affected this was the use of Darkness Falls' database. This meant that creatures, objects, and weapons in that database would give the Mythic team an extra head start in their development, especially with all the engine server backend I previously mentioned. Mythic Entertainment was existing in a time where it was nearly impossible to launch a game without a publisher to handle distribution, especially because everything was hard copy at the time. And everyone except one investor turned down Mythic Entertainment when they pitched Dark Age of Camelot, except Vivendi Universal Games. Many people here are thinking Illuminati thoughts right now, and that's because Vivendi, of course, for the longest time has had a major stake in Blizzard, which makes you realize how connected this whole market is. Dark Age of Camelot launched on October 9th, 2001, and for a game that was only projected by the team to sell 30,000 copies, which back in 2001 would be a major success, Mythic managed to sell 51,000 copies in the first 4 days. We sold about 50,000 units within the first 5 days. We had not expected such a positive response, so our publisher Vivendi Games had made a limited run of boxed product. This, I believe, contributed to our very smooth launch. We did not get slammed all at once as modern MMOs do, and rather we enjoyed a very steady and gradual increase in players, which allowed us the time to respond from a development perspective. Dark Age of Camelot was getting glowing reviews. It had an 88 on Metacritic, and players and critics alike were raving about how much fun the game could be. With Realm Pride strong, there were strong battles and wars between the 3 factions rampant at launch. Realm Pride was rewarded on the server due to them obtaining realm points for participating in the battles as a realm, and the servers overall held up due to Mythic already having experience in running an online game. And having to purchase their own server equipment, they learned an awful lot about server infrastructure, which meant that even though the large battles of hundreds and maybe even thousands could occur in the game, the servers were managing to keep up as best as they could for the time. PvP was the game. Dark Age of Camelot had been designed from the ground up to perform as a PvP title. With Midgard, Hibernia, and Albion all at war with each other, the PvP was clear and away the crowning feature of the game. The reason that 3-faction realm versus realm works effectively is it allows there to be enough conflict shared between two opponents for each faction. For completely unique races with completely unique classes, each faction had a number of apparent differences. This made each battle different, as you had the potential to face as many as 32 classes within 12 races. Think about the amount of options and experiences to be had that would be unique. But also, as the developers early on remarked, 3 factions meant 3 different zones of content, essentially the equivalent of 3 starter zones and 3 leveling zones, as well as PvP zones. And if one faction grew to be too powerful, the other factions were incentivized to gang up and defeat the other faction due to them wanting the buffs that relics granted, which were objects of power in the realm. So players were immersed into their realms and factions, and there was PvP for all types of players. You had small-scale battles, 8-man pre-mades, which were 8-man pre-made groups that would often travel and engage other 8-man teams in RVR leagues. And then finally you have the massive Zerg vs Zerg fight that I think we all can enjoy every now and then the fights that were over the keeps, objectives, and relics. But what made Dark Age of Camelot specifically unique was that 8-man pre-made groups could very well give Zergs trouble. In fact, it's even possible that an 8-man pre-made could potentially even wipe part of a Zerg. 8-man pre-mades were all about strategies. They were about using the proper roles and teamwork in order to take out larger groups. This meant that you had to utilize things like CC, you had to outplay your opponents, outthink your opponents, outposition your opponents. It allowed for the small clans such as mine to thrive in a game that otherwise was very unfriendly to small groups of players. But that's what made Dark Age of Camelot sort of unique. It had gameplay for the large-scale player and the small-scale player, and all the in-between. Dark Age of Camelot, unlike most PvP MMOs that followed, was masterful in that they separated the PvE player base and PvP player base. Many casual MMO fans have horror stories of being killed by a PvP player, to the point that even if you like PvP in a game, you are usually automatically labeled a griefer.
Go to hell, you griefer!
This is usually because in an open-world PvP game, a PvE player can be a casualty of war. But although this is true in some ways, say for example the in-game and PvPvE Darkness Falls dungeon that came shortly after launch, which could be conquered by a realm and then would provide some of the best XP rewards. It was a beautiful merging of the two audiences. But besides that feature, Dark Age of Camelot kept the audiences separate due to the way that frontiers worked. Each realm, so to say, had its home frontier. That was PvP free, aka a safe zone, so to say, where players could PvE in peace, but as soon as you stepped into that border frontier, you got extra XP due to PvPing in such a dangerous zone, and you also got the ability to, well, PvP against the other factions. It was almost like PvE players still had some level of agency, which is likely why Dark Age of Camelot was able to maintain somewhat of a PvE population despite not being a PvE-focused game. And the game did have its weaknesses, and PvE certainly was one of those weaknesses, but that was simply due to them not having enough creatures, quests, or dungeons yet into the game. And those were promised with upcoming expansions, which were said to be free content updates to the game. Oh, the good old days. By the end of 2001, Dark Age of Camelot had a population of 125,000 players. For comparison, its competition in EverQuest and Ultima had populations of 400,000 and 225,000 respectively. Mythic had struck essentially gold with their Realm vs. Realm PvP. The reason that Realm vs. Realm is especially great as a system of in-game is because the whole game is built around it. It has room to thrive and succeed. It doesn't require a whole lot of developer interference. It's emergent gameplay. That means that it's always new and it's always fresh. And there are enough tools and sand in the box for the game to essentially play out on its own. This meant that Mythic as a developer wouldn't be as reliant on pushing out more and more content. This explains why when you look at DAOC's population numbers up to a certain point, they nearly never drop in population for any significant amount. That's because when most MMORPGs launch, they run out of content due to a reliance on developer-made content. People blaze through the in-game content that is finite, but Mythic understood that early on with their small success with Darkness Falls, that long after your game launches, if you can make a compelling and immersive experience, you can have players playing on for years on end, because the ever-state of conflict and PvP content is not finite. By the summer of 2002, Dark Age of Camelot reached as many as 250,000 players, which in hindsight was actually its peak of popularity. By this point of the game, next to no large changes had happened yet, but that's because instead of a bunch of small and spread out patches, Mythic seemed to want to focus on big content expansions. And since Mythic put out consistent content expansions over the next following years, we can use the release dates of each of these content expansions to track the population, and therefore the popularity of Dark Age of Camelot through each of these patches. It's this way we can hope to most effectively piece together the clues as to why Dark Age of Camelot was unable to maintain their peak population, past a certain point. The first of the content expansions launched on November 12, 2002 was dubbed Shrouded Isles. It added 6 new classes, 3 new races, and a brand new land for each realm, in addition to the previous lands. Based on this helpful chart that somebody took the time to fill out in the community, Dark Age of Camelot during this expansion, end of 2002, seemed to have a minor drop in population following the Shrouded Isles expansion. I speculate this is because of the lack of content starting to catch up to them, as well as competitors doing better in the marketplace. It's not a significant drop, however. Within the next year, Dark Age of Camelot had 2 more expansions. One first that added player housing and player consignment shops, both 2 very appreciated features by players such as myself. The population at this point in Dark Age of Camelot jumps back up to 225,000 players. But the third expansion, Trials of Atlantis, came in October 28th, 2003. This expansion added 3 new races, upgraded terrain graphics, addition of boats and underwater combat, and a new form of progression which devs promised wouldn't have a significant effect on RVR. What's interesting about Trials of Atlantis though is talking to the fans, I came away thinking that Trials of Atlantis was this big negative patch or expansion. But through analyzing the numbers and, well, the facts behind it, if anything, the population returned to its peak during Trials of Atlantis, so it actually increased in population. Though there is criticism warranted for the expansion, the master levels that were added to the game as a form of new progression did affect realm versus realm PvP, and thus were a new progression that had to be grinded. It's certainly interesting though. When I go back through and take a look at a timeline of events, and you start to notice that in most MMOs, people base their argument of whether or not a patch or an expansion was good as to whether it was good to them personally, and not historically. And when population isn't significantly dropping following an expansion, it's safe to say that it wasn't the expansion that caused the drop that happened, well, much later. New Frontier is the expansion that launched on June 22nd, 2004. This was probably the most disliked expansion due to it remaking many of the game's core RVR systems. Mythic wanted to add more complexity to the meta they perceived as being stale. They added new siege mechanics and more variety in the way that the map was played. Now there are mixed reviews regarding New Frontiers. Some argue its changes were for the worse overall, and it's often lumped in with Trials of Atlantis for being a problematic expansion. But others believe that change was necessary, and appreciated the addition to mechanics and complexity to the RVR system in Dark Age of Camelot. But what I noticed when trying to decipher who was right, and what the verdict on New Frontiers or Trials of Atlantis was, I made a startling discovery. That throughout Dark Age of Camelot's first 4 years of expansions, it never really gained population after either expansion. It only ever essentially recovered what numbers were lost. It never peaked past 250,000 players, and when the end of 2004 rolled around, well, the largest 2 reasons for Dark Age of Camelot's inability to maintain its level of success or increase it are quite apparent. With the gift of hindsight through looking at the numbers of Dark Age of Camelot's population, truthfully speaking, the expansions didn't really swing the population in any one way or the other in any large noticeable pattern. Although it's fun to talk game theory and speculate what changes had the greatest effects and which didn't, unless we can go back and be there to study them as they occurred, we can only turn to the facts and population data and shrug as we notice that, well, none of the expansions ever seem to really cause a sudden exodus like the NGE did to Star Wars Galaxies. So Dark Age of Camelot, as a game, didn't really fail necessarily. Well, that's up until the end of 2004. Early November 2004, EQ2 launches. Weeks later, World of Warcraft launches. The 2 titans of the time were going head to head, both boasting new gameplay engines, graphics, and 3D experiences. All of a sudden, Dark Age of Camelot seemed dated by comparison. Its now older engine was starting to struggle. Even in Morrowind, which launched in 2004, struggled with the same engine, the dated Gamebryo engine. But more so than just that, World of Warcraft in less than 2 years had 5 million players. The gameplay in WoW was buttery smooth, and the game itself was obviously quite revolutionary in many ways, including ease of access. Dark Age of Camelot immediately took a massive population hit following the launch of WoW. By 2005, Dark Age of Camelot had dropped 50,000 players, now at this point at 200,000 players overall. And even after a number of quality expansions, Dark Age of Camelot in just 1 year later had 125,000 players. This number matches with World of Warcraft and other MMORPGs as they lost population during the same time. World of Warcraft had gotten nearly to 6 million players by 2006. So although I hate the edgy YouTube commenters who say WoW is the reason about every MMO failing, in this case, WoW was an obvious, significant factor in the drop of population in Dark Age of Camelot, way more than any of the previous expansions, not even the controversial Trials of Atlantis or New Frontiers. But it's hard to quantify what sort of effect WoW had on Dark Age of Camelot, other than us simply knowing that it did. My speculation on it is that WoW Classic had a more smooth combat gameplay experience than Dark Age of Camelot could offer. With all of its other streamlined features, it might have been a case of Dark Age of Camelot simply looking and feeling dated. But WoW isn't the only reason that Dark Age of Camelot started to fail. The second largest reason is an interesting one. In 2005, Mark Jacobs seemed to realize he needed to elevate his company past Dark Age of Camelot and attempted to make a new generation MMORPG title. So it shook the web in May of 2005 when Mythic obtained the Warhammer license to make a Warhammer MMO. Now I can't blame Mark Jacobs here. His eyes were set on a bigger picture. In Dark Age of Camelot, despite having a great game and particularly having a playing state that was not losing population at a high rate, it was still, well, getting old. The game looked and played dated, especially as the market evolved. Warhammer Online had its own interesting story that I covered in a video on my channel, but let's focus on why this affects Dark Age of Camelot. Warhammer Online was competition to Dark Age of Camelot, no matter how you slice it. Mark Jacobs was designing an MMO to be very similar to the MMO that he, well, still currently developing. Now to understand why he didn't or couldn't deliver on those promises, my video on the game should explain that. But I would wait until I get an update version of that video. It's a Patreon donation goal, advertisement. But Mythic Entertainment as a company only has a finite amount of resources. It's obvious they start to focus more heavily on Warhammer Online development rather than Dark Age of Camelot. In the span of 3 years, Dark Age of Camelot only launched 2 expansions, and they were more likened to content patches than the full expansions that were released previously. But there were more reasons that Mythic started to lose focus on Dark Age of Camelot, and them being acquired by EA in June of 2006 certainly didn't help. Mythic producer Matt Furore immediately left and was hired by ZeniMax to head ZeniMax Online Studios and work on ESO. And Mark Jacobs began to lose control of his company, especially considering rumors of Rob Denton and him not seeing eye to eye and possible betrayal. Mark Jacobs now had his own bosses, and perhaps we can speculate they didn't want to focus on Dark Age of Camelot as his population was dropping and they were more riding on the success of Warhammer Online. 2 years pass, and the New Frontiers patch, as it was jokingly called, launched on September 5th, 2007. The population of Dark Age of Camelot had dropped below 100,000 players. Expansions nor changes weren't recovering the population anymore, and as Warhammer Online creeped closer and closer to launch, it had a playable beta that likely already affected Dark Age of Camelot's population numbers as well. Warhammer Online launches in September of 2008, and Dark Age of Camelot drops to 50,000 players. The population only continues to dwindle the next few years, as changes are smaller and smaller, possibly due to the limitations of the game engine. But the fans who keep playing the game, the diehard fans, they kept the game alive. Elder Scrolls Online launches in 2013, led by former dev Matt Furore, mirroring many of the systems that Dark Age of Camelot used. The pioneer in that field was certainly looking the part. But Dark Age of Camelot got a random bit of resurgence in 2014 when DAOC was moved to Broadsword Online Games, a company specifically created to run Dark Age of Camelot and Ultima Online functions. Rob Denton would head that company shortly after Mythic would be shuttered by EA. But this was kind of good for Dark Age of Camelot, because although their parent company ceased to exist and they were handed off to another company, this meant that they would get freed of the grasp from a company who stopped focusing on them, and, well, frankly, Broadsword Online Games was going to give them more personal development. In December of 2017, Dark Age of Camelot released a producer's letter discussing their upcoming free-to-play announcement targeted in 2018. They were dubbing it Endless Conquest. This free-to-play relaunch of sorts would make the game focus on RVR features, growing the population by more marketing and more community engagement, and hope to inject more population into the game through the free-to-play business switch. This would allow players to enjoy Dark Age of Camelot through level 50 and beyond for free without a paid sub, but naturally would limit XP, classes, character slots, ease of use, and other similar and typical FTP features. They even further teased that seeming to base such a decision on the reception of their newest launch, that they would consider a new rule set server as well. The rule set hadn't been determined yet, and was a reason why they weren't sure when that part of the plan would actually be ready. But it was looking quite optimistic for a title that seemed to stop getting any significant love. Dark Age of Camelot was still kicking, if only barely, but a free-to-play possible relaunch could revitalize the game, so to speak. But in a bit of unfortunate news, in the summer of 2018, Dark Age of Camelot would be delaying their Endless Conquest update. The website still hasn't updated and says that they're still targeting the end of the year for the patch, but reported to Massively that they would be delaying it to first quarter 2019. So Dark Age of Camelot still very much exists today, though certainly in a state of, well, uncertainty. Will the free-to-play relaunch of sorts come, and will it be successful? Or will the game continue to function on its core gameplay as players slowly burn out? As of 2018, Dark Age of Camelot still has about 6,000 players playing the game at peak, divided amongst the different realms of course. But this is a previous drop from their 2016 numbers, which had them drop from 9,000 players to 6,000 players. And when the new content isn't being implemented anymore, that population will continue to shrink as people who play the game at this point are still paying subscriptions. It also affects the new influx of players, as free-to-play switches nearly always increase both revenue and the player count. I certainly think it's quite impressive a game that's now 17 years old can function with a player base larger than many current MMORPGs, and it's quite apparent that Mythic, despite their failures and ultimate demise, struck gold with the design behind Dark Age of Camelot. My proof for this is simple. Look at the amount of money that Blizzard has put into WoW for it to continue to, well, make money. It was nearly completely reliant on developer-made content, whereas Dark Age of Camelot, who existed before that game, managed to continue to support its population without much increase to population. This meant that frankly Dark Age of Camelot's game model is a bit more sustainable in the long term, relying on players to make the content and giving them tons of ways to do such, and content that incentivizes them to do such was a brilliant move. Realm pride being such a focus in Dark Age of Camelot meant that rivalries were kept alive, and it made it so easy when each side was so passionate about their own factions and their war efforts. Dark Age of Camelot might not be to the same scale of its heyday these days, but its impressions are certainly felt on the market, with popular MMORPGs such as Guild Wars 2 and Elder Scrolls Online both utilizing forms of DAOC's in-game systems. But the reason I think that those games can't quite capture the same magic that Dark Age of Camelot was able to capture was that Dark Age of Camelot was a game carefully crafted to focus first and foremost on its realm versus realm PvP content. That in itself made it so that the game had so much more content within that one facet, and nearly every aspect of the game otherwise served a purpose towards that goal. I think in the case of Dark Age of Camelot, it falls under the banner of what I dub the PvE bias, which means as a PvE player who was PK'd in some other game, you hold this irrational grudge towards all PvPers or PvP games. I often see it parroted on forums that PvP MMORPGs are somehow destined to fail, that EVE was the only successful PvP MMO, and that Dark Age of Camelot couldn't maintain its success, therefore it doesn't count as evidence. I hope that by this point of the video you can already call bullshit on that, because although we can certainly point out the game's flaws, the fact that it was focused on PvP certainly wasn't a documented reason why it failed. Not to mention, Dark Age of Camelot was crafted with a 25-person team in less than 2 years for $2.4 million. Most AAA MMOs have 10 times that budget. You can't knock the success of Dark Age of Camelot. It was essentially a indie niche MMORPG that performed relatively well in comparison to its titan competition. By all initial metrics, the game was a success, and we can certainly say long-term, it certainly has been a success based on its influence. It just was aged out of the market and had to compete with budgets frankly out of their league. Now let's open up our journals. It's that part that I was talking about in the very beginning of the video. Let's write down the key biggest reasons that Dark Age of Camelot failed, to make sure you guys were keeping up with the clues along the way. The engine not properly being able to propel the game to the next generation of MMO gameplay or compete with its competition. Warhammer Online took more resources and took precedent over it after 2005. WoW was stiff competition. Newer, more accessible titles such as ESO and Guild Wars 2 looked to drive inspiration from Dark Age of Camelot, and were able to do so with some level of success. But although we're at the end of this mystery, so to say, this is where things get really exciting. Whether you are a loyalist DAOC fan watching this video who is still very interested in playing the classic game, or whether you have never played the game before and you don't think that you're going to go back and play the game, there's some good news. Mark Jacobs announced back in 2013 he would be working on a new MMO, Sans Publisher, titled Camelot Unchained. This title would be meant to be a true spiritual successor to Dark Age of Camelot, and would be a crowd-funded project on Kickstarter. That Kickstarter has reached funding of $2.2 million, with more funding, $7.5 million, to be also recently injected after a recent round of investment funding. This means that the project has been beefed up to nearly a $10 million budget and is targeting a 2019 launch. Camelot Unchained is currently in its closed beta, and is a game that I am currently testing. Due to the NDA, I can't really share much about it, but what I can say is based on what has been released for the game so far. Camelot Unchained has the ability to be far greater than Dark Age of Camelot ever was. CU, as it's often dubbed, features a game designed to make crafting a paramount feature of the game, to support their total focus on realm versus realm PvP. You have the ability to essentially craft anything, including giant structures and castles. Think of a Minecraft building system of sorts. This off the bat ups the ante, as it was never something you could dream of doing in Dark Age of Camelot. Not to mention, all of this territory capturing grants you resources. So now resources and crafting are a very integral part of the realm versus realm experience. I wish Camelot Unchained and Mark Jacobs the best, and I look forward to that project continuing to be developed and hopefully be as successful as it can be. For those looking to play Dark Age of Camelot in the meantime, there are loads of friendly and helpful people you can speak to on the forums who will explain any problems you guys have with the game. The leveling experience is greatly altered at this point, and come their free-to-play launch, it might be worth rechecking out the game for those who missed out on it the first time. Though it's safe to say, if Camelot Unchained can be successful in the marketplace, it certainly could change the landscape of MMOs. And boy, is that exciting to think about. It's also beautiful to see the vision that made Dark Age of Camelot what it is. It still exists in Mark Jacobs, and its spiritual successor in Camelot Unchained. Dark Age of Camelot's death of a game might not be about its literal death, but I think it's safe to say Dark Age of Camelot won't be dying anytime soon. Not with its extra life. Thanks for watching, guys.